afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We can see the numbers creeping up on the screen, or rather shooting up. So before we get started fully, I'll give those of you who are still joining a chance to log in. While you are, let me introduce myself for starters. I am Regan Hiles. I'm the Head of Transnational Education here at Universities UK International. And today we're really excited to be bringing you this webinar in collaboration with our partners at the British Council Mexico, who will be speaking for the lion's share of this to give you their insight on the ground about what is working in Mexico in terms of TNE. This webinar is engaging with Mexico, new developments and opportunities for international higher education partnerships. So as I mentioned, my name is Regan Hiles. Let me introduce my colleagues. We have Rodrigo Moreno joining us in Mexico at the moment, and we also have Salvador Lopez from the British Council Mexico joining us in London. To run through this session, we will be covering firstly an introduction from Universities UK about the work that we do and why in particular we're looking at Mexico in this webinar. We will then hand over to Rodrigo Moreno in British Council Mexico, who's gotten up very early this morning to join us, so thank you for that, Rodrigo. He will be doing a very quick run through of the facts and figures as they pertain to the Mexican HE landscape, latest policy developments in Mexico, internationalization in the Mexican system and future TNE opportunities. After that, we will be taking your questions, hopefully able to answer them immediately, but any that we can't, we will field and make sure that we get back to you. So without further ado, I will move on to firstly the introduction. Universities UK is the membership association for universities in the UK. 136 universities are members at present. But Universities UK International is a little bit different in that we also have membership from Guild HE, which is similar to Universities UK but represents small and specialist institutions. So through that, Universities UK International represents the UK on global playing fields and can be the voice of UK higher education overseas. Our purpose is up on the slide that you can see at the moment, and it's specifically to help UK universities flourish. We do that in a number of ways. We have several different networks which are mostly regionally focused. We do have some thematic networks, for example, our Outward Student Mobility Network. Many of you watching will be members of our Latin America network convened by Safia Tioun, who has also done a lot of the work in putting this webinar together, so we're indebted to her for that. We publish reports, some of which are annual publications, one which I'll be drawing on a lot in giving the introduction to this session, the scale of UK higher education TNE. And there are other kind of ad hoc reports about particular moments of interest or policy changes on the global landscape for higher education. We also do a lot of influencing work, particularly with government here and overseas. So for transnational education, one recent example that some of you will have seen is the signing of a memorandum of understanding between Egyptian and British government to welcome UK campuses into the Egyptian higher education system. We recently launched this series of webinars as a means to more directly disseminate information about the countries that we're working with, and also particularly to draw in our partners with expertise in these areas. Just like today, we have the British Council partnering with us for this session. So the report that I just mentioned, the scale of UK HE TNE, was published earlier this year. It related to 2015-16 statistics on TNE. We have since received some more recent numbers and we're analysing them. But this data comes from the Higher Education Statistics Agency. It's the most reliable sector surveying that there is. And we've also seen the numbers reported relating to TNE more closely start to match what universities tell us they're doing. So we're very confident that this gives us a good picture. In 2016 to 17, over 700,000 students were studying for UK degrees outside of the UK. That's a phenomenal number. 6 more universities reported TNE numbers than the previous year. That represents a growth at surface level of about 1% more TNE than the year before. But when we take out 3 major providers who kind of skew what the landscape looks like, that growth looks a lot more like 4%. It's 1.6 times more students studying overseas than it is international students in the UK. Looking specifically to why we're talking about Mexico today, I'm going to look at both the analysis we've done of North America and South America, because technically in that analysis, Mexico is captured within the North America numbers, but of course its context aligns a lot with South America. So UK TNE in North America, when we last dug through these statistics, it was the 5th highest number of TNE students in North America at 5%, and it was reaching 36 countries, territories, or administrations. Growth in the last 3 years has been around 30%, although actually in the last year it declined slightly. Of all the regions in the world, North America has seen the lowest average year-on-year growth in TNE. The top 10 host countries in North America have stayed consistent during those 3 years. Only the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands have swapped place in those rankings, and they've literally just scooted between 7 and 8. And in terms of what TNE is going on, 61% of it is through distance, flexible and blended provision, a quarter collaborative provision, and 14% registered with an overseas partner. If we look at the picture in South America, it's a little bit different. It's the lowest region for UK TNE when we look at student numbers. It's fewer than 1% of what's going on in our TNE. But it's possibly the most interesting area because of that, because we've seen changes within that 1%, and that 1% looks set to grow. TNE is reaching 14 places in South America, and it's grown by about 20% in the last 3 years. Last year, it stayed static, but we are hearing a lot more about programs in development, so next year I would expect to see that grow. And in fact, it's had the fastest average growth rate of any region over the last 3 years. Similar to other areas, it's almost all distance, flexible, blended and distributed learning. In fact, that's very high for South America. And it's almost all postgraduate, 92%. In the last 3 years, the top host countries in South America in terms of student numbers stayed the same. But it's worth noting that within that, 2/3 of the students are in Brazil, Colombia and Guyana. They're the only countries in South America that have more than 100 TNE students. And looking at why we're here talking about Mexico today, there is a really strong history of working between the UK and Mexico. And 3 years ago was the 2015 Dual Year of Education, a major bilateral initiative to strengthen and celebrate that UK-Mexico HE relationship. Student recruitment from Mexico to the UK has grown by 52% in recent years. And there are lots of recent developments, particularly around research, to grow those links. The Newton Fund Institutional Links was recently launched, and later this year there will be a higher education links call, which I think Rodrigo will be talking about a little more. Internationalization is a national education policy priority in Mexico, shown by things like the National Development Plan 2013 to 18, the Sector Plan for Education, the General Education Law, the Law for International Collaboration. We could go on, but I think you get the sense that Mexico is keen to work globally. And in fact, since 2007, research has found that most Mexican universities have created policies to promote internationalization, many of which look beyond the traditional student and academic exchange. Particularly relevant to transnational education is the 2015 Mutual Qualifications Recognition Agreement. That's very important for the ability to operate in country. We've seen that hinder the growth of TNE elsewhere where qualifications aren't recognised. That agreement seeks to enable students, staff and professionals to move more freely between systems and labour markets. The graph that you can see on your screen is a poll that we did of UK universities about 2 years ago. And it asked where they were looking at their TNE. And it showed actually that for the next year to 3 years, they were looking in very traditional markets. But beyond that, people started to get more imaginative with the reach of TNE, and that includes Central, South, and Latin America. We're starting to see that play out in the numbers. So TNE in Mexico is quite small scale at the moment, as I've mentioned. It's under 1% of the current UK TNE reach. But there are 43 universities operating in Mexico, and that suggests that plans within those may be indicative of growth. 19 have fewer than 5 students. I think it would be unlikely they would stay with only having fewer than 5 students. And these numbers in and of themselves are particularly meaningful. So it may be that 740 TNE students looks like a small number. It certainly does compared to the major markets in Asia. But when you look at that as almost 180% increase in the last 3 years, 36% increase in the past year, we can see that this is really an area that's starting to grow. In fact, Mexico is particularly strong when we look at North American engagement. This is the list of the top ranked countries in North America by student numbers. Mexico is 5th. That's a lie, this is South America. But it's the same on both charts. And in terms of Latin America, it's 2nd in student numbers. It has the highest volume of TNE students for non-Anglophone countries in the region. If we look at how that's split out, Mexico's TNE is roughly even, slightly more postgrad to undergrad. Comparing to the 2 main regions, 75% postgrad in North America, 92% in South America. We look at the split, distance, flexible and blended, and then studying for an award of the reporting provider are the most common areas. Just to compare, we look at North America and South America. We see something similar, but in more extreme proportions. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Rodrigo. You may hear a click as we swap presenters, and then Rodrigo will appear on screen with his slides. Thank you very much.
Hello all, my name is Rodrigo Bueno, and I am the head of higher education of the British Council. And well, I will explain general landscape of the higher education in Mexico. Well, first, I would like to explain that the higher education system in Mexico, it's huge because Mexico is a country with a complicated geography and a big country. So there is 2 different higher education kind of institutions, private and public. The public more or less has the 70% of the students, and the private has about the 30% of the students. Among the main institutions of the public higher education institutions are the Tecnológico Nacional, which, for give you an example of how big it is, it has more than 500,000 students, and only in technological or engineering areas. There is also the Polytechnic University, Technological University, and those are a part of the Ministry of Education. So, and they are distributed all along the country. We have also in Mexico the UNAM, the Autonomous National University, which has campuses in the main cities of the country, and is a very prestigious university But as you can see, it is not the biggest, because the Tecnológico Nacional system is bigger, and also they can qualify some other institutions because they have their own system, because they are autonomous. And a part of the UNAM, there are also autonomous universities of each state. That means 32 autonomous universities. Plus, in some states, there are sometimes two systems of state-funded universities. Each system is independent. So if you talk with the Ministry of Education, you are not reaching UNAM, or you are not reaching the state universities. And if you are talking with Tecnológico Nacional, you are not talking with UNAM. And also, there are the private higher education institutions, which are some of them are very prestigious universities with a great quality, and some of them they are with bad quality. So there is no assurance that if you are engaging with a higher education, a private higher education institution, will be of good quality or bad quality. Just by being private. And also with the public higher education institutions, you have to understand that the main research that is conducted in Mexico is run by the public higher education system. Well, I will continue. As you can see in the system, those are the qualifications of the of different systems. You could be technical, bachelor, and you can get a specialty. And you can see the number of hours in this slide. So all of this is an analysis we made in order to understand the qualifications and how they are compatible with the UK system. Okay. In 2014, and it was ratified this year, we signed the mutual recognition of qualification with the UK. Now we are in a very interesting stage, because the agreement has been ratified by the Senate, and has been published in the Journal of the Federation. That means it is public, it's ready, it's approved. So it is functional as an agreement. So now we are approaching, and we are moving forward with the Ministry of Education to put all the rules, because in Mexico there is a certification that the Ministry of Education issues that you can do the paperwork through internet. So it is really right now it is really easy to get this certification. It is called Cédula Profesional. It's a professional document. So now you can get this professional document with a professional schedule with your through internet. So for international education, I think this is an opportunity. And once we have the agreement with the Ministry of Education, once the Ministry of Education set the rules to get the professional schedule through internet and for qualifications from the UK, I think there will be a lot of opportunities. But it works both ways. So now Mexican students can get recognition in the UK. Well, about the mobility. In Mexico, Mexico sends a lot of students abroad. And the main region Mexico sends students, it's Europe. And that's very interesting because it is not the United States. I mean, the United States, it's very important, but as a region, Europe is the main destiny. And among the countries of Europe, it is Spain. This is the students we have sent to the, well, Mexico has sent to the to Europe, and this is the division. The main figures, the main students, the gross figures are in postgraduate, research, and TOEFL. So there is a lot of opportunity in undergraduate and first degree students. Well, the trends that we can see as for growth of mobility, it's of course the United States, but as you can see in Germany and United Kingdom, there is a lot of expected growth for 2024. Why it is? Because the quality, because as Mexico is the principal country in North America of as part of Latin America, but as we are in North America, we want as Mexicans to move to United States or to another countries of the developed world. Normally, the mobility of Mexicans is through Europe or the United States, and that's why we, as Mexicans, move to Europe. Okay, the main country is Spain, as I said, and it's followed by UK and France and Germany, and that's very important because I'm sorry. Because the language is a barrier for Mexican students. And that's the reason the mobility goes to Spain. But as you can see, even France or Germany, which has a different language, has wonderful figures for mobility. And we believe it's because they already have an operational MRQ agreement working. So now, as we have it with the United Kingdom, I believe we will have a lot of opportunities, and in the next year, we will see the number increasing to the of mobility to the UK. And as a matter of fact, and that's very interesting, in CONACYT, as the main funding agency in Mexico for mobility of students, has the main destiny, the main country that it's funded by CONACYT is the United Kingdom. And that explains that the Mexican students look for quality. So there is a match between funding and quality in the UK, and what the Mexican students are looking for. For us, it is an example of the opportunities and how they will be present the scenario for the future. And then among the main universities, this is very interesting because we have not a whole statistics of mobility. Those are the partial mobility, the mobility of students who already are in institutions. So the main institutions who have mobility are the ITES, that is the system of TEC de Monterrey, the Ibero, the University of Guadalajara, the ITAM, and many universities, private universities like the ITESM, ITAM are private universities, and Ibero. But what I would like to say is that this year, UNAM has become the main university that sends students abroad. The main subjects, the main areas of knowledge that those universities send students are laws and social sciences and administrations and finance. Finally, some insights about internationalization in Mexico. If we approach to the how the government enable higher education institutions to internationalization, you can see that before the approval of the recognition of qualification, the mutual recognition of qualifications, and even with this agreement, there is not a good environment for mobility if you analyze the Ministry of Education and how the government enabled this. So there is a problematic for this. But how does the internationalization happens in Mexico? It happens through direct contact with universities. The universities are very active and very interested in internationalization. So besides the government policy, the Mexican universities are engaging in internationalization. So that's the scenario. So that gives us a lot of opportunities. The main opportunity is that now we can you can engage, or the universities should engage in successful, sustainable, and mutually beneficial partnership with Mexican universities. The best example of internationalizations are like this. So also, the internationalization shouldn't be in a single area. Should be, for example, student mobility, but also have an holistic approach. The most successful programs that in internationalizations for Mexican institutions has been in mobility, of course, but for students, for staff and researchers, and also for qualification and institutions. Also that drives the institutions to share teaching and delivery partnerships. So they start collaborations in research collaborations, also programs, parallel programs of especially for PhDs or master degrees that are recognized by institutions abroad and institutions in Mexico. And finally, the opportunities. The opportunities are engaging directly with universities. The universities are the door to get into the Mexican system of higher education. So there is not a one entrance door. The approach to the biggest university or the most recognized universities is the most important. It's the way the UK universities can internationalize and can start a good relationship and a good partnership with Mexican universities. And for example, programs like the program Institutional Links, Higher Education Links, and the Newton Fund, which linked the main focus of those programs is to establish relationships in research and in mobility of students, in mobility of staff and teachers, to establish new relationships with Mexican institutions. Just to say, those programs have been very successful because although there is a lot of collaboration between UK institutions and Mexican institutions, through these calls and in specific areas, they can start new collaborations and discover new areas of collaborations and new contacts to start collaborations. And finally, the opportunity are mobility, of course, more agreements of mobility with universities, with more Mexican universities, with regional Mexican universities and technological universities. And I believe there is a huge opportunity for distance and parallel programs. Distance education is very important for Mexico. Mexico has a good access for internet, and through institutions, the best institutions, there is a network that can work for that. So there is an opportunity for distance education, and also for parallel programs. The most successful and the beginning of internationalizations for Mexican higher education institutions was through parallel programs. And well, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rodrigo, and welcome back. We'll just pop our webcam on and you will see that next to me, as soon as that pops up for you, I've been joined by our third contributor, Salvador Lopez from the British Council, Mexico. And now it's really time for you. I'm sure that you have many, many questions that have been occurring to you as we've been speaking. So please do pop them in the chat box and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can in the next 20 to 30 minutes or so. But don't worry if it occurs to you after we finish the webinar, and we will still take questions and field them for you as best we can, even offline. So before we get into the questions from you, if I can just invite Salvador to introduce himself.
Well, thank you.
Any reflections so far?
Well, I mean, actually, I'll leave it to the universities to take advantage of the time that we have. I'm happy to answer any other questions that there are. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, I realise it may take a little time for some of those to come through, but if we can just start off with a very quick question. Rodrigo, you mentioned CONACYT scholarships. For those people watching who aren't familiar with CONACYT, could you just let people know a little bit more about what they are?
Well, yes. CONACYT is the National Councils for Science and Technology. But and it is, just to say it fast, it's a funding agency. It's a main funding agency in Mexico, but it is also it's like the Ministry of Science and Technology. So it's the institution that put in the agenda the science and technology areas and policy in Mexico. And that's why it's not only a funding agency, but it is also a policy maker institution.
If I just complement that, traditionally for UK universities, CONACYT is the main body for scholarships coming into the UK. However, more and more we have identified that state agencies. So now you have CONACYTs at state level, and we have 32 states. Each of them has its own funding and its own priorities to send people abroad as well. So more and more we've been identifying that there's 15,000 students from the single state of Guanajuato going to the USA for the last 3 years. Short visits, but still large numbers of people being moved out funded by state agencies. So not everything stops at the national level. There's also 32 more funding agencies.
And I think in that gone some way to answering our first question, but I will still throw it out there. What opportunities, if any, are there for universities who don't work with CONACYT so far? I'll start with Salvador and then I'll come over to you, Rodrigo.
Yeah, I think precisely that goes in line with what I was saying. CONACYT is not everything. You know, it's not the only agency. Certainly is one of the most important, as you saw in the numbers. They sent over 2,000 students to the UK every year, but it's definitely not the only one. Another avenue, which is not public funding itself, funded students. There's a very high number of people going into the USA because of family ties, because it's very close, because of language. We're very exposed to the USA. However, more work towards private universities, especially, and people that can afford to pay for themselves is a pretty good way in into raising the profile of a university that doesn't work directly with CONACYT. CONACYT, on the other hand, is heavily focused on STEM subjects. So engineering is the buzzword for CONACYT. If you don't work in those areas like arts or social sciences, humanities, etc., another way in is, as Rodrigo was saying, is go directly to universities, create partnerships with universities that have a common interest as you do, and raise your profile there.
Rodrigo, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, well, just reinforce that what Salvador said, that the main focus of CONACYT is, of course, STEM and engineering. So, but there are also another ministries in the federal government for arts and humanities, like the Ministry of Culture. I mean, each ministry has their own scholarships directly a part of CONACYT. I mean, CONACYT traditionally has been seen as the scholarship source in Mexico, but there are a lot of sources in for each ministry of each government agency. And as Salvador said, in the States, they have funds. Sometimes they cannot spend all the funds they have for internationalizations, because students, even Mexican students, don't know how to approach them. And in the other cases, those states agencies or governments, they don't have the relationship with universities abroad. So the problem is, of course, that there is not one door to knock at. So, but yes, there are a lot and very divided sources of funding.
Great, thank you, Rodrigo. One of the questions that we've had come in actually picks up on something that you mentioned, Salvador, about interest in STEM. We've had a specific question about subjects and interest, and it was one that I was going to raise as well. The question that we received in particular is about science and whether that is in demand or not. So Salvador, if I come to you first and then we'll come across to you again, Rodrigo.
Could you elaborate a bit more around science?
That is a very good question. Perhaps if you can outline more broadly kind of what subject interest there is in Mexico and what gaps there are that would need filling, perhaps.
Right, okay. I mean, it's quite straightforward. If you go down to the National Development Plan, for example, that draws down into the priorities for CONACYT, that draws down into the calls for scholarship, it's very clear that Mexico has a very strong advocacy for engineers, a very strong advocacy for energy-related subjects, for automotive, electronics, so a lot of advanced manufacturing type stuff. Again, if you go down at state level, it depends. Agri-tech is a big thing in Mexico right now across many states. Health sciences, quite a lot of money going into it. Rodrigo, I think you can complement a bit more, but I think those would be the main priorities where I would focus.
Rodrigo?
Well, yes, those areas are the main energy, but also pure science. I mean, hard sciences. I mean, physics, chemistry, biology, just like that. And the main the main opportunity for those areas are of course our CONACYT. It is CONACYT for funding and for partnerships, but also each state science ministry. So there are just 32 states in Mexico. So there are 32 science and technology institutions to ask for funding, plus CONACYT. So that's how complex it could be. But yes, there are a lot of opportunities. Science is a priority, a national priority. Applied science and innovation are very important. There is a lot of money. And also right now, private industries are engaging into funding science and technology. So now, as there's a lot of investment in agri-tech, in also the transportation industry, but that means also airplanes, aerospatial industry. So there is a lot of capital and a lot of interest in preparing human resources for the future.
And staying with subjects for a moment, Rodrigo, I'm going to come straight back to you. We have been asked energy, arts and humanities, and collaboration opportunities in two very different areas there, but the level of interest.
Energy, of course. And there is even in Mexico, there is a Ministry of Energy. But for example, an example, no? The Ministry of Energy has a program directly with the Technological University of Barcelona, with the Supercomputing Center of Barcelona for a postdoctoral program. So that's the way they engage sometimes. So it doesn't go through CONACYT, but there's a lot of interest of ministries and institutions. And energy, well, we have a Ministry of Energy, so yes, a lot. Energy is very important.
Fully paid by the Ministry of Energy, may I add.
Yes.
So lots of ministries is to potentially work with. Arts and humanities, who wants to take that first? Let's go Salvador and then Rodrigo.
Rodrigo mentioned something before. Again, CONACYT per se, it's not a priority for CONACYT, but there are more agencies, like we have a Ministry of Culture now, and within the Ministry of Culture, there are different agencies that deal with arts, with cinema, with the visual, etc. So it depends where. It's all about finding where are the agencies. But yes, it is a priority. It's just not for CONACYT.
Rodrigo, anything to add?
Well, as a multicultural country, as we are, and as we have a really strong arts industry, and so yes, there are funding, as Salvador said, to the Ministry of Culture, and the Ministry of Culture is of very recent creation, because before that there were institutions of fine arts, cinema, and all the division of humanities and arts, and each institution had its own budget. Now they are trying to centralize them through the Secretary of Culture, but it still is very divided. And also, as I said, each state has its own Ministry of Culture. So again, and they have their own budget, their own priorities, because culture manifests differently in each region of Mexico. And even food, for example, in Mexico, is a part of our culture, and it's very important. And because nobody thinks about that, but there are funding for research in food, and not in food industry, but in a culturally related food. And yes, there are a lot of opportunities for areas not related only with science.
Wonderful. I'm going to pop back to a few questions that we've skipped over because those grouped together quite nicely. But we have some procedural questions that have come through. Rodrigo, you mentioned towards the end of your presentation parallel programs. Can you explain what they are?
Well, yes, there are programs what we have seen are very successful, and that happens with different kinds of university and areas of knowledge. One way, and I was just reading another question, that for a parallel program, you don't need to register with the SEP. I mean, you made an agreement with a Mexican university that agrees with the UK university about quality, about credits, about, what you has to assure as the program could be rated, it's equal, no? The quality of the program is more or less the same. Then after, and that's very important, as it happens with university, some universities are very prestigious in some areas, for example, health, but are not as good as for example, in finances or economics. So in some areas are the best universities, and in some areas not. So sometimes some programs are very good. So with that programs, they are very interested in engaging with universities abroad. So they create a parallel program with part of the program being in Mexico and part of the program being abroad. So, and you get a double diploma, no, a double certificate, one for the university abroad and one for the university in Mexico. So that's why it's and you assure that the student will get the same education in both universities. So those dual programs or parallel programs work very well, and has been a way for universities to get into internationalizations. And I believe the internationalization in Mexico, one of the ways it started was through those parallel programs before the mutual recognition of qualifications agreement. Well, that's an explanation. So you can go, I mean, as university, you can go directly to a university, and well, through us, we can help to that, no? And you can talk about a dual program.
That's really helpful and covers off a question that we had about needing to register with the ministry before or after one develops a partnership. Picking up on that, we've had another question come through, and please do keep sending in your questions as you're watching and they're occurring to you. Is there a comprehensive ranking of private universities that we can rely on when looking for a partner in Mexico? Salvador's nodding, so I'm going to turn to Salvador.
Yes.
Of course there is. I mean, reliable is a strong word, obviously, especially when you talk about rankings. But there are a few rankings that you can look at. Very recently, Times released its Latin America set of the ranking. It includes Mexico, and it includes a comprehensive list of universities. They themselves have been very vocal about the fact that universities are not contributing with as much information as they would need, and that is one of the weaknesses of current rankings that are already there. There are another set, a couple of Mexican rankings. I don't have them on the top of my head. Rodrigo, you might know the names, but there are a couple in Mexico that you can rely on. Is there a way in which we can send participants some information after?
Yes, we'll be sending out a link to be able to access this webinar for everyone who had registered, actually, and I think we can probably include it in if not, we'll pull out the email addresses.
Okay.
Yes, we can get some information about that because, well, of course, and there are media rankings, newspaper rankings, which are a reference, and also the one thing you have to take into account is that rankings are complicated, as Salvador said, because, for example, as for research, public institutions in Mexico, as I said, are where they concentrate the research, the main part of the research in Mexico. So if one UK institution wants to engage in research, public institutions are the partner. But for example, if you want to engage into a program for students for education, of course, public institutions are a very interesting partner in some areas, and private institutions are specialized. So one university is specialized in engineering, other university in economics, other university in humanities and arts, and others in health. So ranking those universities, it is complicated. I mean, it's really complicated to trust a rank. I mean, we can send information, but also sometimes you need a direct approach to the university.
If I may suggest, if you're looking for partners in Mexico and you don't have an idea of where, there are two institutions that you can reach out to. One is in the screen in the name of Rodrigo. The other one is ANUYES, so UUK equivalent in Mexico, the National Association of Institutions of Higher Education. which again we can put you in contact with.
And we have regular dialogues with Annoyus, and it's great to see this all coming together. So I'm going to turn to another question, not directly TNE related, although from every partnership springs the opportunity for another partnership. What has the trend been in terms of outward mobility from the UK to Mexico in recent years, and how do you see this trend developing in the future? Followed by a cheeky but hopeful question, I think, of is there any funding of students going from the UK to Mexico? And before I hand over to Salvador and Rodrigo, I am going to shamelessly plug some work that we do here at Universities UK about outward student mobility. The next issue of our Gone International series of cohort studies will be out on May the 10th. And that does look at where UK students are going. So you'll be able to see the latest numbers in our report in just a few days. But plug over. Salvador, you were looking at this question when it came in.
I was, because it's a very interesting question, but the answer is not that positive, I'm afraid. I think the trend is from non-existent to very small. The number of UK students going to Mexico is quite limited, and it's generally to institutions that are very high ranked, like UNAM, like Tec de Monterrey, like ITAM, and in very focused areas, as Rodrigo was saying. We definitely see a positive outlook in the future with a number of agreements that have been developed over the last few years. For example, we recently launched a call Higher Education Links last year, and we were surprised of the number of applications telling us we are going to create a joint PhD, we're going to create a joint master's, we're going to do mobility in X area. So that there is a lot of buzz around mobility in both ways. Unfortunately, the numbers as of now are not that great. And funding, yes, there is funding. And I have to say the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is the main agency that provides this alongside CONACYT, they always complain that those numbers are not achieved and the money is not spent because of low number of applications. There is an agency called the Mexican Cooperation for Development Agency, MXC, within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they themselves have funds for people to come over and spend a period of studies in Mexico. And depends on the level, from postgrad up, CONACYT is also an agency that provides funding for that.
I'm going to draw it to a close there, but I think that would be a very interesting thing for us to look at to see whether new TNE ventures can also incorporate some of that. We're seeing a growing interest in transnational education and mobility working together. And I think, Rodrigo, that sits very well with some of the comments that you were making towards the end of your presentation about a growth in holistic internationalization and strategy.
Well, I would like to add something to what Salvador said, just because I think there's not also a good mobility from the UK to Mexico because universities are not well known abroad. And for example, I was talking the other day with the director of the Secretary of Internationalization of the Tecnológico, Ofelia Angulo, and she was saying, if you can tell UK students to come here to Mexico or professors to have a stay in Mexico at the Tecnológico, I could open one of my a university or one of my places with first I can give them a place to stay within a family. I can give them, the student that is coming to the Tecnológico, the location into a touristic place, I mean, over the beach, a colonial city, a wonderful place. You can go to Cancun And the only condition, yes, and she said, the only condition I will ask is that they give some English classes to my students. So just an example about the disposition and that the institutions have, but sometimes it's not exploded. It's not. There is no knowledge. We are not aware about this, and I believe that as we are, if we start to promote Mexican institutions, there will be more. There will be they could increase the mobility from the UK to Mexico, because there is a wonderful disposition of institutions in Mexico. They want to do it, but they don't know how to do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think on that point we need to wrap up, but we can also move to a few areas around where you can find out more. And I think that language issue is something that we'll definitely need to delve into if TNE partnerships are to grow, and what needs to be done and what can be done in English language versus other language. In terms of what is coming next, first of all, we would like to gauge your interest, for those of you who have joined us this afternoon, in a potential delegation if we were to put that together, that would focus on TNE. If you think your university would be interested, please just type yes in the chat box so we can get a sense of interest. On top of that, we do have an information note that we'll be publishing in the next few weeks that looks at the potential for UK higher education TNE in Mexico. That will pick up on some of the themes that we've already talked about this afternoon. And there are workshops coming up that the British Council Mexico will be hosting in the UK, also in May, about enabling UK-Mexico partnerships, particularly looking at research, but all of this is part of one big picture. If there was something that you didn't have the chance to ask or we didn't manage to get to, please do email it to tne@international.ac.uk, and we will certainly do our best to either answer you directly or contact our friends across in Mexico and get that answered for you. So on that note, we will finish. We hope to see you again at our future webinars, at our workshop about Europe at the end of June, and at our TNE conference on the 3rd of October. But thank you very, very much for joining us, and thank you in particular, muchas gracias, to Salvador and to Rodrigo. Many thanks. Hope to see you soon.